Doherty, and I'm a legal consultant at Municipal Research. And we have today a presenter, Bob Bass from AT&T, and Shane Murphy, who's the Director of Community and Economic Development. Shane Hope, I'm sorry, from Montlake Terrace. And we're venturing into this issue because we're transitioning into another phase of wireless antenna deployment. You may recall 14 years ago, there was a lot of controversy when a lot of the wireless towers were initially being deployed. People were concerned about the size and locations and the aesthetics of the various antennas. And we had some residents that were very concerned about wireless radio frequency emissions. Well, things have calmed down, and Bob is going to explain what's coming up as we move into a new phase of antennas that are typically very smaller. And this is to deal with the increasing number of devices that use wireless transmission. And so we'll get into that. And Municipal Research hasn't been getting many calls about wireless antenna issues, which surprises me a little bit because there have been some new federal regulations, and that's part of what we're going to be discussing today. I'll turn this over for a few comments from the technology people. Mitch here, and this is being sponsored by AWC, and Mitch helps to run these webinars technologically, so fill us in, Mitch.
All right, so we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, verbally and written. So if you have called in on your phone, you can, at the designated time, we'll tell you how to unmute your phone, or you may have heard that when you first logged on, and then you can ask your question at that point. Before you do that, though, we ask that you raise your hand through the webinar software. That can be found when you're logged in at the top of your screen. There's a Q&A tab. You can click that, and that'll open up a question and answer area. So if you would like to ask a question verbally, there's a little hand you can click to raise your hand. That'll let us call on you, and you can unmute your phone at that point and ask your question. Or you can type in your question, and we will get to it as they come in and divvy them out that way. And once your question's answered, we'll dismiss it, and you can ask another question if you'd like. But again, that's just found at the top of your screen at the Q&A tab, and that'll open up the question and answer panel. So we ask that you hold your verbal questions till the end. If you have a question you'd like to type in at any time, that's okay. We'll get to it when we can then. So back to you.
One final comment. We will be posting, the webinar will be posted on the AWC website, and Municipal Research will also link to that, and we'll have additional documents that we'll be posting on our website. And the slide presentations, the PowerPoints will be posted, so rather than take copious notes citing federal regulations, I suggest that you listen carefully and review the materials later again if you need to. So I'll turn it over to Bob Bass from AT&T to fill us in on what's coming down the pike.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I wanted to thank everybody at EWC and all of you who are watching and listening today for the opportunity to be here on behalf of AT&T and talk about what we think is really an exciting time in our industry and an exciting time for AT&T as well, and really what's driving what's happening out there. If you can go to the next slide. I don't think that is the next slide. Yeah. A different deck than the one I said, but we can go through. Yeah, that's a different. Well, it's a different deck. I'll go through my deck, and we can just do this as a verbal presentation. Okay. What's the exciting time in our industry is as you look across the landscape and across the country, more people are choosing wireless services. They're choosing wireless technologies and replacing a lot of other things. The latest numbers from CTIA, which is the wireless industry organization, there are over 327 million wireless customers in the United States, or wireless subscriptions. So if you think of the number of people who are in the United States, you see where we're kind of almost have, or close to, or more wireless subscribers than we have people, which is a good problem to have in this country. And one of the things that's happening is that you're seeing more and more people get rid of their traditional landline telephone service. And in the United States right now, the latest numbers from that came out from CTIA showed that approximately 38% of America has abandoned their landline and they go with a wireless service only. To bring that to the state of Washington, those numbers are around 40%. And if you were to take a segment of the population in the state of Washington from, say, age 18 to 29, that number is at about 65 to 70%. And if you go below age 18, some of those people probably don't even know what a landline is. And so as the population ages from that group, those numbers are going to continue to grow up, or going to continue to grow, which is going to place, more emphasis on us working on our networks and providing more coverage and service. Another issue that happened, and I think it's a great issue, one, because it happened at AT&T first, which was the launch of the iPhone in 2007, which really set off the whole rapid expansion and the response by other equipment manufacturers, and smartphones flourished. You saw responses from a whole host of companies, and now you see smartphone adoption. You think of the things a smartphone will do. A smartphone, probably at the bottom of the list now is to make a phone call. It takes pictures, it shoots video, it's your internet access point, you listen to music on it, you watch videos, and that has driven a lot of traffic on our network. So with the number of people who are substituting, plus the addition of throwing smartphones onto our network, and now tablets, you see today that whether it's an iPad, you see the Microsoft Surface type of a product, Kindles, and you add that traffic on the network. Since 2007, we've seen a 30,000% increase in the data traffic on our networks. One really interesting statistic is that in 2013, the number of tablets sold was more than laptops and desktops combined. So you're throwing all that traffic out onto a wireless network. So that, again, it's a good problem for us, but we've got to do a lot of expansion in our networks, upgrades to provide those services. And then video on all of these. Think about YouTube and all of the things that people do with YouTube. It's been an explosive growth on our networks. An interesting stat for Mobile Future in their end-of-year review that in 2013, people who watch video on a wireless device doubled. So all of that kind of gives you a backdrop of what we're doing. And it's not just individual consumers and households that we're seeing go through this transition. It's also business. Business, whether it's small or medium-sized business, you rely a lot on your smartphone. So if you're operating within the local communities that you all have jurisdiction over, people are out and about all day long using their smartphone, using their tablet. That's how they're connected to the office, how they're connected to their customers. And it's really important that that experience for them is first class. And if you had the deck that I'm working from the study, 66% of small businesses said that it would be very difficult, or that they cannot survive, or it'd be a major challenge if they weren't able to access wireless technology. And it's not just small and medium-sized business. Speaking from the perspective of AT&T and what we're doing with our employees, and it's no different than other Fortune 500 companies, we're all looking at cost structures. And one of the things we look at is traditional bricks and mortar office complexes with thousands of people who are located in them. And what we're doing now is we're giving, unless you're a customer-facing employee, we're moving most of our employees giving them the option to go work from home. And so what that means is they're going to have a smartphone and they're going to have a tablet, and they're going to be working from home and doing the work for AT&T that they would if they were sitting in an office environment. What that's going to mean as well is we're going to need to push more capacity out into neighborhoods and places where we haven't been before. And early in my career, there were times when, high-speed internet launched, landline-based high-speed internet. So I used to hear from local economic development folks, from local government folks, the realtors who wanted to know, where is it, when's it available, how fast is it? Well, I'd submit to you today what people do when they're looking for homes is if they're looking for a new home, they stand outside the house and see how many bars of LTE coverage they've got at that particular location or within that house. So it's a big issue from that perspective as well. So we've seen the demand, we've seen the fact that there's so many different devices and ways devices are used, and it's essential now that AT&T or other wireless companies, we have to be able to upgrade and expand our products or the network and the services to provide that. The one slide that I'm covering now was to show the evolution of the wireless network. It might be on track now. If you can see that slide there, and I've put this in here for two reasons. First of all, you can look, this is from about a 2005 through present day evolution, and I don't know how many people in the room were excited when you could get 250 kilobits on an edge network. It was pretty exciting times. And as you can see, we got UMTS back in 2007, 2008, and then high-speed download packet access, and then the upgrades and iterations of that, where we are present day today with LTE. And I think it's pretty common to find 20 to 25 megabits per second on LTE networks, and you're going to see even faster speeds as enhancements are made to that. I mention it for a second reason and focus on this slide because a lot of times when we're in local jurisdictions, we might get, a question might be posed, well, we just approved and you built that site 2 years ago. Well, a lot of the evolution on that slide right there was done through just typical software upgrades and changing the electronics that were within the network. But what's happened over time is we've had to go in for site modifications, which many of you in your local jurisdictions see the site modifications that we have to do where equipment is changed out. And that's some of the discussion that's happened at the federal level, whether it's, we all hear the four numbers, 6409, or from last session in the Washington legislature, House Bill 1183, those type of, the language that's contained in there that deals with site modifications, because a lot of the things that we have to do for future networks is to try, or not try, but we're changing out equipment on existing sites as well. See what the next slide is in there. Well, we're on track again. That's good news. I put this slide in here to highlight again that, as a company, this is just one company in this wireless ecosystem, that the work that we do to meet the demand of all of these devices and things that we have to do to our network. Nationally, over the last 5 years, we've spent over $100 billion on our network. It takes a lot of money and a lot of effort to provide that experience that the customers are looking for. This last year, we also announced a plan called Velocity IP, which in your jurisdictions might have been a reason why you saw an increase in the amount of activity from AT&T representatives in the state of Washington. And you probably see a lot of our folks in your jurisdictions, particularly the folks from Bush Law Firm, a great group of people who represent us in the state of Washington. But some of the centerpieces or the cornerstones of the VIP effort was, in addition to adding more macro sites, as Jim mentioned, you're going to see a lot of small cells. And this is a national number on the number of small cells in the state of Washington. But one of the things you see in the second to the end there in the bullet there was that to expand 4G LTE to over 300 million people in the United States. As many of you know who are on this call and this webinar, you saw a lot of activity from AT&T, and just to give you a kind of a summary of the volume of that in 2013, in the state of Washington, we had roughly 1,000 sites in well over 250 jurisdictions where we were either having a new site build, an existing site, site modification to an existing site, or providing additional backhaul to a site. So you can see that that's a lot of activity in the state of Washington, and using a crystal ball, you're going to see similar activity in 2014 from us, or a similar pace from us. It's just the way the wireless world is going these days. It's going to take a lot of time and effort. On the next slide, to bring it to the state of Washington, although the numbers say from 2010 through 2012, if you were to take that through the end of 2013, we spent over $2.3 billion in the state of Washington. It's a number that I'm particularly proud of because on behalf of the 4,600 employees who are here in the state of Washington, it's nice to see that we invest in our own state, and it's a place where we live. And one of the things I mentioned too, as we go through the process of getting approvals and permits to deal with local jurisdictions, and we go through public hearings, and a lot of times people will mention, well, why are you putting it here? This is where people live. Well, I'd like to highlight that we live here too. As our employees, we raise our families here. These are our neighborhoods as well. We have a lot of thought and a lot of process goes into making sure that we're a good neighbor in this whole process, and dealing with all the local jurisdictions in the state of Washington who, I want to point out, do a terrific job. We really appreciate all of the hard work. We know it's not easy in dealing with the issues that we present with our expansion of our network, and we really appreciate the work that is done in the state of Washington. The next slide really summarizes what is happening, and it's just a really high level of what we're working to do. And at a basic minimum, we want to make sure we minimize drop calls. Everybody, it's the most frustrating thing in the world to drop a call. We know that, every carrier knows that, and we're working constantly to try and improve that. We want to improve network speed because everybody enjoys the fastest, the latest, and the greatest. But that second to last bubble there is really, really important, and that's to decrease the latency, because as more sophisticated applications require, the packets to arrive and where it's really critical for that particular piece, decreasing the latency is really, really important as we densify our networks. And that's something you'll hear from probably every carrier, but from AT&T, densifying our network is critically important to reduce the latency for these applications to run. And then obviously you want better capacity and coverage, which, as Jim mentioned, capacity is going to be an issue that comes up a lot. Going to the next slide, you can see it used to be in the old days, most of the work we were doing was coverage related. We were trying to provide coverage in areas where it hadn't been before. That's still part of what we're doing because there's areas that have been difficult to reach for a number of reasons. So we're still, as part of our, if you were to use Yogi Berra math and say 30% is this, 40% is this, and 50% is that, this is a certain percentage of that providing coverage. But a lot of what we're doing today in your communities is we're bolstering capacity. Because of all those smartphones and the speeds and the usage, capacity is critical for us to improve that experience that customers want. And I would submit that it's the same thing for every carrier that's out there providing the same thing for their customers. But capacity is going to be a big thing. And as you can see there in that first bullet, that densification becomes an important part of what we're doing as well. And through Velocity IP, which was that project to add additional macro sites, small cells, and distributed antenna systems, that's important as well. And then infill, we always run into problems in our network where we may have built a site 3 years ago and an enterprising apartment gets built 5 stories, has 600 units in it, and the coverage on the other side of that now is hit with a shadow, and their coverage has been degraded. So we have to figure out ways to find those. That's just an everyday thing that we go through in our business. The next part of this is, there's a lot of ways we figure out where we're looking to put facilities, where we're looking to upgrade facilities, change, densify, network data. Our engineers are pulling metrics off of sites every day, every site, the number of calls that go through it, whether there's drop calls, the capacity issues, time of day, those sorts of things, because we always want to be able to improve the performance on our network. And customer input is one of the things that we hold probably most, that we cherish the most and use the most. And we really encourage, and whether you're an AT&T customer, and just as an aside for all of you personally, an AT&T customer or anybody else, always let your carrier know if you've got an area where you're dropping calls. We do a lot of testing, a lot of things, and sometimes there might be an area we're not aware of. So I would encourage you, regardless of who your provider is, to let them know that. And then we take a look at the average of what's going on through these metrics, and then we're also able to forecast. One of the nice things about AT&T in the state of Washington is that in Redmond, Washington, we have our AT&T labs where every device that's going to be hitting our system is tested. So we know devices that are going to hit the market in 12 months or 24 months, and they're being tested right now. So they may provide some information to us that we need to add to our forecast. So with that sort of information, our network data, the metrics, knowing where we have some holes in our network, those are some of the things that we look to as we plan. And then there's some other factors. Obviously, there's parts of Washington that are very hilly. We have tall trees. There's other parts that have rolling hills. There's canyons, lots of water. We take those things into consideration. You know, in a perfect scenario, you put a cell site on a hillside through a flat area, and you can get coverage up to 6 to 8 miles without many users. But if you to the right there, when you've got a more dense area, it may require us to have a site every quarter mile or 3/4 of a mile. And then within major urban settings, you might find across the street or on a corner, you've got 2 sites right across from each other, just because of the huge amount of demand and traffic. So the types of sites, everybody is pretty familiar with the macro site. This is your typical, could be a tower, could be a monofur. Hopefully you've seen monofurs in the state of Washington. It could be on the side of a building. It could be on top of a building, on a light standard, one of those things. That's a typical macro site. Those are critical to our network and how we provide the experience for our customers. Below that, the distributed antenna system is used in more, you know, arena, stadium-like areas where you've got a lot of people in a smaller space. Good example of that is CenturyLink Field, which is going to be critical this weekend, as there's going to be probably 70,000 people who are hopefully going to be shooting a video of a pick six with Richard Sherman and then sending that to all their friends. We've got a distributed antenna system inside that stadium that we did a couple of years ago, but recently upgraded. And so it's almost like having 8 to 10 cell sites within the stadium. It's still, that is even stressed, because Seahawk fans are some of the most tech savvy in the NFL, and they're using their smartphones throughout the game, but it's a good experience. But those are where distributed antenna systems go and are very helpful. And this says small calls, but it should be small cells. Those are probably the latest that you're going to see a lot in your communities. But I would submit that the biggest part of what small cells do is they're complementary to the macro sites and the macro system, and part of the whole delivery of coverage and data throughput for consumers and customers. They don't replace macro cells, but they're very complementary. One of the things I like to, in my mind, the way I understand the small cell in relationship to the macro cell is kind of like heating in an office building. You've got your heater that runs through the ducts and it heats the building, but there's always spots where to bolster it. You've got some space heaters. You couldn't heat a building efficiently with just all space heaters. You still need the overall bigger system, but they're very helpful. But they're very helpful to us, the small cells, in the more dense areas, the more urban areas where we can use it to complement and to fill in and densify, because densification is really, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is really important as we're doing what we're doing with the network. And then the Wi-Fi hot zones, we're all pretty familiar with those. So finally, we've set the stage. We know that demand is up, the number of users, the types of applications. We've taken all the network data, the input from those metrics, the customer information. We've taken projections from what we see devices going, trends, and then our radio engineering team goes out and takes all that data, and they send out search rings to our construction and engineering team, and which are basically coordinates and areas within where they need to consider where new sites would go. And all of you on the call and watching are familiar with this whole process, where then that search ring gets passed on to a construction and engineering team. It's probably no different for other carriers, who then go out to find suitable locations within those coordinates that were given to them by the radio team. And what they do is our first choice, and I hope everybody watching and listening today knows, is our first choice is we want to co-locate. We want to be able to go to an existing structure. We want to be able to go somewhere that already is there. It's the quickest way for us to get something online. But I would add that one of the things that we run into sometimes is we need a willing landlord. Sometimes we may see a cell site and it'll be pointed out by a local jurisdiction. We think you should go on this. You should go on that cell site. Well, one of the problems we run into is that the landlord could be another wireless company who won't let us on there. It could also be that the engineering of the site, there's no more capacity to put more equipment on that site. So that limits us as well. But after that, we're looking for existing structures. We're looking for water tanks, tops of buildings, sides of buildings, light poles, light standards, all of those things, because the last thing we want to have to do is to have a new structure go up. But that's kind of it's the progression list as we go through the whole process to build. And then, as you know, once we find a suitable location and go through the process with all of you on the permitting to make sure that everything's done correctly, that things get approved, changes that are made, and that sort of thing. But that's all I have for today, and I look forward to answering any questions, and appreciate again all of your interest and your time today.
Thank you very much, Bob. And now for getting into some of the nitty-gritty and the federal regulations, we're going to hear from Shane Hope from Montlake Terrace about what the existing regulations are and some changes that have been introduced in the past few years, and also some new proposed regulations that are in the works with the FCC. So, Shane.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to know how interested people are in the subject. So, moving to the next slide. Again, I'll just touch on some of the things with federal and state regulations, and also a little bit about local governments that may want to update their regulations. So, starting again with the federal and state regulations, I want to also remind everyone that local governments have an interest in a lot of things related to their community, certainly community livability, scenic issues, historic preservation, economic vitality, all of those things, in addition to the fact that many communities are involved in providing emergency services, which happen to use wireless facilities in many cases. Local governments are the ones who have the authority to set up permitting processes and make local zoning decisions. All of these relate as well to wireless telecommunication facilities. There are some limitations on what local governments can do, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So we have the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This is an act, a federal act, that refined the Pole Attachment Act, popular topic, I'm sure, among many, but it's actually was the first major overhaul of telecommunication law for about 60 years prior. It was also the first time the Internet was specifically addressed with regard to broadcasting and converging the broadcasting and telecommunications abilities. It also established some limitations on local and state authority when it came to telecommunication facilities, and we'll talk about that. So, because of all of these issues that came about, and I might say that one of the limitations from the Act of 1996 was to say that local governments needed to make decisions in a reasonable amount of time. What that meant, of course, was a subject for some dispute along the line. So the FCC in 2009 made a declaratory ruling about some issues related to interpreting the Act of 1996. And one of those things was what has been referred to as a shot clock. That is, saying that when it comes to co-location of wireless facilities, 90 days after an application was filed is a reasonable amount of time. But in other cases where it's not a co-location issue, 150 days was a reasonable time. Now, they also specified more about what co-location meant, that it included any existing facility, whether or not there was a wireless facility already there, but an existing building or structure would be another way to understand co-location. And it also identified that when it comes to tower co-location, that wouldn't include things where there's a substantial increase in the size of the tower. And the next slide will tell us how that was interpreted related to the national programmatic agreement for co-location. So substantial increase would mean that the existing tower height was increased by 10% or more, or that more than one space for an additional facility. So whichever was greater. It also included that mounting facilities would not be more than, say, 4 cabinets, depending on the type of technology that was being used, or that it would protrude from a tower more than 20 feet at the location that it was sited on. And also that that substantial increase meant that it would be something that was outside of the immediate area for excavation. So, moving on. The declaratory ruling then again specified that shot clock. It also allowed for there to be some negotiation around it with regard to the applicant and the municipality when there are special circumstances, where there could be some court cases where there was some dispute about it that indicated that 90 to 150 days was not reasonable for very specific reasons. Also, the local government has the ability to notify the applicant, if they do so in 30 days, that their application was incomplete. So if that was the case, there's 30 days to get that straightened out, notify the applicant, and they can resubmit or add additional material as needed. So the shot clock stops while that occurs. That declaratory ruling also then meant that state and local rules about timelines were preempted for the most part. Certainly could go shorter than the shot clock, but not longer in general. And it also clarified that service determination was not dependent on, is there one carrier that's already at that site? That is not an adequate defense for denying another carrier. And in fact, there must be a substantial evidence demonstrated by a local government to deny an application, and that has to be on the record and defensible. For 2 cities in Texas, San Antonio and Arlington, I believe, that challenged FCC's ruling, and that went through Fifth Circuit Court and so on and up to the Supreme Court in May of this past year, 2013. The Supreme Court ruled on that. They upheld key parts of FCC's ruling, and in particular that established that FCC does have some authority, has authority to interpret a number of aspects of the Telecommunications Act, and in fact to establish a shot clock with specific guiding amount of days for applications to be reviewed. As was mentioned earlier, and another law has come into place, and that was one that was adopted at the federal level in 2012 called the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. But one section of it, 6409, specifically dealt with telecommunications issues, and it mandated that state and local governments must approve what's called eligible facility requests for modifying existing wireless towers or base stations. And again, this kind of language comes in about substantial change. So if substantial change is not there, they must, the local governments must approve those. But of course, there are a few issues about what all that means. The law does say that the eligible facility requests are those that involve co-locations or removal of existing transmission equipment or replacement. And it does definitely preempt certain local authorities. Not that local governments cannot review requests. They certainly continue to have that authority, but it does limit where they can say no. And it does specify that the National Historic Preservation Act still applies, as does the Environmental Act, NEPA. Now, FCC is proposing to adopt more rules to clarify the last rules adopted the last law adopted in 2012, and perhaps other things from the Act of 1996, or to clarify things from the declaratory ruling of 2009. So they've published that just last month, published their proposal. They're looking for comments on what the topics that they want to cover. Those comments are due February 3rd of 2014, and they plan to reply to the comments a month later. So the issues behind that, as is specifically identified in FCC's latest publication, they're looking to, again, expedite the environmental review process, particularly related to the newer technology and the structure types for telecommunication facilities. They're looking to narrow perhaps the exemption on pre-construction for environmental notification on temporary towers, and again to clarify that new section 6409 about state and local authority. They may also address different issues that have come up from the declaratory ruling. So there are many questions. That's a fairly lengthy document, the publication that came out recently from FCC. There are many issues that will be of interest to local governments. For example, what constitutes a base station? How do you know what modification means in a particular instance? What does existing mean? Well, it might seem obvious, but what about, for example, something that's been vacated? Is that still existing? And should the standard for substantial change that we've talked about, for example, the 20-foot protrusions, et cetera, should that be different on towers than, say, on buildings or utility poles? What about the so-called stealth or camouflage conditions that local governments often expect in certain locations so that the towers in particular are not so visible? Does this change anything? Should in general, federal rules further restrict how local authorities permit telecommunication facilities? Those are just some examples. Again, we think that as the industry is looking at this, local governments also should look at the proposed rules and the process for it and consider whether to comment on any aspects of that. You can find that from the website that's referred on the slide, or I'm certain do a search from your web browser and find that specific publication. Also in 2013, the State Environmental Policy Act was updated partly. The Department of Ecology adopted new SEPA rules, and those SEPA rules made personal wireless service facilities here in Washington State a categorical exemption from certain SEPA review. That applies specifically to what's called microcells, small cells attached to an existing structure. The same thing with wireless service antennas attached to an existing structure, not including residences or schools. It also applied to construction of a service tower that's less than 60 feet tall in certain types of zones, commercial, resource zones, etc. And then it gave definitions for those personal wireless services and for microcells as it applies to SEPA. Actual law was changed also by Washington State Legislature. That was mentioned House Bill 1183. It exempted from SEPA review those facilities other than those located in a designated critical area for co-location purposes and construction of wireless service towers in certain zones when it's less than 60 feet tall. And there are some specific definitions in that House Bill 1183 about what substantially changing the physical dimensions means. It largely echoes what was in the ruling that we talked about from the FCC in 2009, but may have some minor differences. Ecology also plans to further amend their SEPA rules to reflect some aspects of the newest state law about that. So, for local governments that might be thinking about whether they need to update their own rules, here's some things to think about. First of all, of course, how long has it been since you have updated your rules, particularly if new state laws or the FCC's rulings have happened since your last update. You probably would want to go back and take a look at that. Here's a few things to think about with your local regulations. Do they address the shot clock requirements? Do you have something in there for SEPA exemptions on co-locating facilities? And do you have the definitions in there that match state or federal laws? What about the application criteria that you have? Is that, again, consistent with the laws and regulations that are in place now? In particular, do you have streamlined review for co-located facilities? And are the rules really up to speed for today's needs and issues, today's technology? Or what about tomorrow's? Something to think about. If you are updating your code, I would recommend that you really look at, is the process clear for how telecommunication facilities are reviewed? Is that clear to all that would be involved? Does it recognize the new technologies, distributed antenna systems, small cell, etc.? And does it make co-location an easy option for wireless facilities? And of course, is it consistent then with the federal and state requirements that are there in place today? And what about when the new FCC rules come out? You want to think about that as well. So some resources to look at, of course, Municipal Research Service Center has a website. They'll be updating it as we go along. There are a number of other websites, including law firms, that have information out there. There's plenty out on the web that you can locate to give you more information. And we think that this is a time to really begin taking a look at it if you're not already in the process. I think the real challenge is that all of us know our communities are special places where people are looking to have attractive facilities, looking for the particular needs of communities and neighborhoods. And at the same time, we all know that cell phones are something we all use, and they need wireless transmission. So finding the right balance to help these great technology approaches meet our needs is what we all face today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. I would like to point out that if you haven't updated your regulations recently, the federal declaratory rules and the recent law changes do apply. So if there's a conflict between the federal rules and your code, follow the federal rules. You don't have to have the shot clock provisions in your specific code, although I'm surprised because we looked through a number of city codes and we didn't see any that were mentioning it. But even if that isn't in your code, you need to follow that timeline. And I have been encouraged. I was talking to Bob before we went online here, and he says that there hasn't been much problem in AT&T's interactions with local jurisdictions, cities, and counties here in the state, and we hope that it continues to be a cooperative process. If you have questions, don't hesitate to talk to your city attorneys. for planners, or contact Municipal Research, and we'll try to provide assistance and documents that can help you understand what's relevant. We will also encourage you, if you do update your wireless code provisions, provide Municipal Research with a copy, and we like to have examples to post on our website for other people to look at. We realize that every city has different terminology, a different approach, but there's certainly a lot that we can learn from each other. So I think we're going to look at questions from the audience. So let's see what we have.
Do you want to read out for sure?
Sure. You can go ahead and read it. Where there's one question, I think it's for me. It says, in light of new building construction, potential interfering with coverage, block, or degradation, is AT&T considering being involved in the review of such structures to address how to minimize such impacts? And you know, it's difficult to say, but I think at this stage of the game, I don't think it's AT&T's place to. I think it's more of that's an environment that we're going to have to deal with, because anything could happen. I mean, you could have any number of things that happen, but it's really not our place to get involved in land use planning that's going to involve, you know, the building of an apartment complex if it's going to benefit a community.
What is the citation for the USC decision? I can look that up and post that on our website. What I would say is that the court did grant broad authority to the FCC in their ability to interpret the Telecommunications Act, and that's has encouraged, I think, the FCC in rolling out their latest set of proposed rules. But I'll get that citation and put it up on our website.
Do the presenters recommend updating a city code prior to issuance of the FCC rule, or waiting until after the rule is finalized?
Boy, that's a tough question. I think it's probably going to be 4 or 5 months before the FCC comes out with their action. It's now a comment period, a reply period. I think it might be wise to think of this as a moving target. You might want to at least really be up to date with, start examining your code, and if it's not consistent with the latest rules and regulations, tweak it now, but realize that you might have to make additional modifications in the future. I think that the rules are going to continue changing. I think it's hard to wait until we're at a point where we feel that things are solid. This is a moving target.
I would suggest that if people really haven't updated for a long time, that they do so sooner rather than later, or at least start the process for it, because there are things that are happening out there. But in other cases, it may be just waiting a little bit for the latest tweaks and go with that.
Is AT&T coordinating with other carriers?
We don't, at a national level, we work with CTIA as our industry organization, but in terms of coordinating on the placement of facilities, we don't do that, because for competitive reasons and probably some other reasons, it wouldn't be a good idea. We do speak with other carriers about, for instance, knowing that they might own a particular site that we can co-locate on, but we don't coordinate with the other carriers on how we build our network. We do, have discussions when we know somebody might have a site. And one of the things you're seeing as well these days is that most of us are no longer owning our own towers, and that there's tower owners that own those. So I think the tower owners and the Tower Industry Association coordinates more with the carriers than the carriers would with each other.
There is a mention of SEPA exemption for towers 60 feet or less. Does this height include the equipment on top of the antenna?
I don't know the answer to that question. It probably is just 60 feet.
I think that would mean the top of the tower.
We don't have any more written in questions. I see John has his hand raised. If you would like to ask a verbal question if you have the ability to, if you're called in or your computer has a microphone. You can press *6 to unmute your phone, and you can ask your question that way. John, if you had that question, you can do that now. Or anyone else, if you have a question, you can type it in, or press *6 to unmute your phone and ask your question. We'll give you a minute or two to do that. Okay, we have a question. What does an appurtenance that protrudes 20 feet or more from a structure look like? I'm envisioning it projecting at right angles to a building, for example.
I think that's a fair visual. I mean, it's going to be attached and it's going to stick out. And in some cases, it's not always going to be a right angle, but depending on how you point your antennas, but it's going to be an extension off of, obviously, the structure.
And most of the antennas are less than 20 feet from any structure. I don't know that I've seen many that protrude any further than that.
Now, and I think you also, I mean, for the balance of the structure itself, you've got, engineering issues as well.
Okay, we'll give another minute for anyone to write in any more questions. Oh, we got one. May a city require additional lease compensation for a replacement or modification of an antenna that is located on city property?
Well, I think what you want to do is look at, Bob, is look at your lease provisions. If someone's making a major change, hopefully there's a clause in the lease that addresses that. If not, I think you're going to have to sit down and do some negotiation.
We'll give another minute for any more questions. For AT&T, can multiple smaller structures in the same location, light poles, do the job of taller towers?
You really need the small cells aren't a replacement for a macro, although for infill, you can take a number of small cells to provide similar coverage in a smaller area. But they're not a replacement. They work in concert with the macro site in the overall network. But you're going to see that we're going to be putting a number of small cells into urban locations because it's providing the infill and capacity offload for the macro site. It's all about, with so many, for instance, if you look in downtown environments, we may have small cells across the street from each other. You may have several within a block area. So they don't replace, it's a complement for the larger sites.
And, Bob, I've got a question. I keep reading about these distributed antenna systems and microsites. Does a small antenna require as much of an equipment cabinet or supporting structure? I know a lot of cities have been concerned about equipment cabinets, for instance, in the right-of-way. I think the FCC has a requirement that there be backup generators. So, it may be a small antenna. What's hooked to that antenna?
Well, as you know, the wireless networks are really radio networks. And so when your device communicates with the tower, it's a radio connection. What backhauls from those sites is actually in the ground. Or it could be microwave. So there's either fiber in the ground to a site, or there's, you're using, any type of broadband connection that goes to those. On the small cell side of it, the state of Washington, for eligible telecommunication carriers, requires 4-hour battery backup. So the question now is about how do we deal with using small cell and whether battery backup is required for each individual small cell or for whether it's a whole area of small cells. So there, you probably all have seen what a small cell might look like. It's about the size of a piece of paper that we've deployed in other parts of the country and that we're looking to here. So the supporting system of that goes into the ground in the cabinets is much larger. It requires backhaul just as you would from a normal site.
So structurally, I mean, how big is the equipment cabinet that would go with typical small cell? Are we talking about something, a bread box, or are we talking about a box that, a big device?
It's not huge, and if, I know in some communities, many people have thought it's going to be like VRADs, or, you know, where you've got landline video or DSL or high-speed internet at the boxes that are put in neighborhoods. You're thinking you're going to have some monstrosity that's going to be sitting there, and that's not what accompanies the small cell. It's much smaller. It all fits on the pole. And some of the designs I've seen, again, those designs are changing because as we talk, there's different vendors who are proposing and looking to do different things with the equipment that we're using. But what I've seen in some of our deployments that we've done, they're small. It's not like a huge refrigerator sitting at the bottom of a pole.
And I think that's one of the benefits of all the new technology is that everything's getting a lot smaller. So I'm hoping that these deployments will raise a lot less issues in our communities.
Okay, we'll give another minute for anyone to write in any questions. Again, if you're on the phone, you can press *6, unmute your phone, and you can ask a question that way too. So we'll give you a minute. And if there are no other questions, then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we can...
Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to AWC for hosting this webinar. We expect there will be questions. If you do send in questions, and we think they'll be worthwhile, we'll put them as Q&As on the MRSC website. And